along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. We've recently relocated both of our branch locations to Union Market and the Wharf and have started hosting events there as well. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to kindly ask you all to please silence your cell phones as to not disrupt the event. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a standing mic in front of this pillar here to your right. Please line up there and speak clearly into the microphone so that everyone can hear your question, as we will be recording for today's program so that you or anyone that you know can soon find it on the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following this, we'll have a signing table up here. So if you've not already purchased the book, we do have copies up at the front behind the checkout counter. We will ask you to line up starting at the pillar, and then we'll come by and ask you for your name for any personalization. So please have your books ready for us. Once the event is complete, we'll simply ask you if you could please fold up the chairs and lean them against something sturdy just to help out our events team a little bit. So now, without further ado, today I'm very excited to welcome Meryl Gordon. Gordon is a New York Times bestselling author of Mrs. Astor's Regrets, The Hidden Betrayals of a Family Beyond Reproach, Bunny Mellon, The Life of an American Style Legend, and The Phantom of Fifth Avenue. She's an award-winning journalist and is a tenured journalism professor at New York University. Her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, New York Magazine, and the New York Times. So let's all welcome Miss Gordon.
Wow. You sit in your little office and you write a book and you don't think anyone will care. And on a cold night, and I understand there's a really big football game on tonight, so some of you are really sacrificing. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Now, people are always curious, how did you come up with an idea for a book? I went to a Broadway revival. The City Center in New York every year brings back old musicals. And in 2019, they brought back Call Me Madam, which, as many of you know, was the Irving Berlin musical based on Perle Mesta's life. And I happened to be looking for a book topic at that point, and a friend of mine said, what about Perle Mesta? Now, I don't know about the rest of you. I had been hearing about Perle Mesta for my entire life, and she really was quite an American phenomenon. She was born in 1892 in Michigan, at a time when there were very few opportunities for women. As you may remember, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920, when Perle was 28 years old. Perle was ambitious, and she wanted to make a difference in this country, and she single-handedly made that possible for herself. When I began researching newspaper archives, I found nearly 100,000 articles in which she was either quoted or mentioned. If my eyesight is not as good as it once was, it was looking at microfiche late at night. She was one of the most famous women in America, and she was famous for many different reasons. She was one of the first women to be appointed to be a State Department foreign envoy sent to Luxembourg by Harry Truman in 1949. She was a crusading feminist, also a quiet force for civil rights. She was friendly with 3 presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, and LBJ. She was also close to Hollywood and Broadway stars who would perform at her Washington shindigs. Perle gave huge parties at Democratic conventions from 1948 until 1964. She'd actually planned one in 68, but the riots she had to cancel. And in 72, she didn't go, and there was a syndicated joke that went around saying it could not be an official Democratic convention because there was no Perle Mesta party. Now, Perle wrote a best-selling autobiography. She traveled the US giving speeches. In addition to Call Me Madam, which became a movie, Perle's life was featured in a CBS docudrama. And she was interesting because she was both serious and she was frivolous. She wrote scorching opinion stories for newspapers about trying to improve opportunities, particularly in government for women. And then she wrote an entertaining column for McCall's about how to deal with tipsy guests. She was very wealthy, but she never came across as kind of a snob. She appeared kind of fun-loving and irrepressible. And let me say, she was a shameless social climber. I mean, we all know Washington social climbers, but she really was the top of the list. but she was also endearing. And she was mocked for her weight, for her appearance. You wouldn't believe the fat shaming that happened in that era. You know, she was described as plump, and it was not nice. So after I was reading all these clips, I was kind of amazed that she had never merited a full-fledged biography. And this is my fourth biography, and it was a very different experience. My three previous subjects, Brooke Astor, Huguette Clark, Bunny Mellon, had all died right before I began researching and writing, so I could talk to a lot of people who knew them well. Perle died in 1975, which meant that most of her contemporaries were long gone. I was able to talk to her two great nieces. I was able to talk to the children and grandchildren of her friends, both of LBJ's daughters, Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of Ike and Mamie. I was able to talk to people like Anne Blackman, who covered Perle for the Associated Press, Sally Quinn also, who covered Perle early in her career for the Washington Post. And there was a ton of stuff in various presidential libraries. Now, in 1949, Time magazine ran a cover story on Perle. And they sent reporters all over, to Newport, to London, to Michigan, to Oklahoma. And those reporters, as is the day, they sent back their files back to New York, which were compressed into a sizable cover story. But Time donated its archive to the New York Historical Society. There were 150 pages of notes on Perle. Delicious stuff on the feuds with other Washington hostesses, my favorite part. And most of this material had never seen the light of day, so I had the pleasure of doing that. So let me tell you a little bit about Perle's background. She was born into money, and she married money. I've never managed to do that myself, but maybe some of you have. So it's not a rags to riches story, it's a riches to riches story. Now I'm gonna try, this is my first time with a slideshow. Perle in her heyday, glamorous, Parisian gown, and small child. Perle was born in Michigan. Her father was a very ambitious Michigan farm implement salesman. Actually, at the time she was born, her parents had moved to Texas. Her mother gave birth visiting the in-laws. Her father made his first fortune. Another Perle and mom. That's Dad, William Skirvin. He made his first fortune in real estate in Galveston, and then he made a second fortune as an oil wildcatter. And then he moved to Oklahoma City, where he built the largest hotel, chasing other opportunities. They moved in 1906. Perle fell in love with the state. And I've never quite understood this, but she lied. She lied about many things. She lied about her age. She never admitted her age. And she lied about where she came from. She always said she came from Oklahoma, even though she came from Texas. Perle wanted to be an opera singer, and her father actually sent her to a conservatory in Chicago, where she discovered that she didn't have quite the talent. Meanwhile, she had this younger, gorgeous sister, Marguerite. And Marguerite, as a teenager, became a huge sensation both on Broadway and in silent movies. And their father had best idea about who should keep an eye on Marguerite. He deputized Perle as Marguerite's chaperone. So for 2 years, she traveled the country with Marguerite. She was backstage. What I've been fascinated by is in Perle's autobiography, she never mentions that period of her life. It didn't happen, I don't think she liked being off stage while her sister was taking the bows. Now, in 1915, after Marguerite was 22 and established, Perle moved to New York to seek her fortune, and she was then in her early 30s. And she met this visiting Pittsburgh businessman, George Mesta. Now, George was from an immigrant Italian family, scholarship at engineering school, but he had launched this massive company, Mesta Machines. They made turbines, they made all sorts of equipment. They later supplied the government during World War I. And Perle didn't know much about Pittsburgh, and he didn't know much about Oklahoma or Texas, but they fell in love, got married, and she moved to Pittsburgh. She hated Pittsburgh with a passion. Pittsburgh didn't much like her. The society people thought she was a hick from the sticks. She wasn't invited anywhere. She stayed home and played the piano. And then World War I happened, and her husband was named a $1 a year advisor to President Wilson. Perle came to Washington. I suspect if I asked all of you, how many of you were born in Washington, there were very few hands would go up because I see a hand, I see a hand, I can see a few hands. All right, a few hands, but as you know, for the rest of us who came here for one reason or another, Washington has always welcomed newcomers, and Washington welcomed Pearl. And she figured early on how do you social climb in Washington? She realized that a lot of government officials had a lot of power and no money. So she would get George Mesta to buy charity boxes of the opera. She would offer to give debutante parties for the daughters of the influential but penniless. And she developed a lot of friends. She also began this habit of making friends. She made friends with the next door neighbors, the marshals, the vice president. They introduced her to other people. It was this process of like trying to figure out, understanding that if you know X and you invite X to dinner, then everyone else will go. We love Washington. In 1925, Pearl and George Mesta went to New York. Things were going really well. He was building this glorious new mansion for them in Pittsburgh. They came in for a business dinner in the theater. In the middle of the night, Pearl saw George. She got up and said he wasn't feeling well, went to the bathroom, died of a heart attack minutes later. Pearl is now a very wealthy and distraught widow because he really was the love of her life. She had inherited a large chunk of excuse me, of Mesta stock, and she did something that very few women would have done in 1925. She insisted on being put on the board of directors. And she didn't stay in Pittsburgh, but she went back for yearly meetings for a decade. So since she hadn't liked Pittsburgh in the first place, she resettled in Washington and then also began going between Washington, New York, and Newport, this three-city thing. Pearl was said to be worth, at one point, more than $50 million. She went through it all. I was kind of amazed, discovering, at the end of her life, there was like $500,000 left. I mean, we will discuss how she spent the money, but I don't know about the rest of you. 50 million, I think I'd be okay with it. Now, she's back in Washington. Her uncle asked her to give an engagement party for some family friends. A niece was marrying a man named Milton Eisenhower. Yes, those Eisenhowers. So Pearl met Ike and Mamie in 1927 when Ike was a lowly major. And she would have all of her life, she would make these friends who were nobody then but became somebody later. Now, the Depression. Hoovervilles, people are starving, bread lines. Not our Pearl. Our Pearl is so rich, she's renting mansions in Newport. She's moving into the same place Andy Mellon lives in Washington. She's got a place in New York. And it's funny, do you remember all the Frank Capra movies during the Depression where there was this carefree heroine? Somehow, newspapers settled on Pearl because she was here, there, and everywhere. And let's see. That's George Mesta. And this is, Pearl was being presented at Buckingham Palace to King George, which is pretty fabulous. And she was very close to Hoover's vice president, Charlie Curtis, so she was always at White House events. Now, in 1939, Pearl reinvented herself. She was always looking for something to really care about and be involved with, and she had been involved in politics as a Republican. Her father was a Republican. She reinvented herself as a crusading feminist supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. And for the rest of her life, that was the defining cause of her life. In 1940, she was a member of the National Women's Party. She went to the Republican convention in Philadelphia. And there was a movement to put the Equal Rights Amendment in the platform. And Pearl at that point was, she knew senators from Oklahoma, Texas, Michigan, Rhode Island, you name it. And she found that smoke-filled room and she convinced those men, and there were huge headlines in the New York Times saying, oh my gosh, ERA and the Republican Party. So that was a big deal. She was very upset about how the Republicans treated Wendell Willkie. She became a Democrat. She also convinced the Democrats to put it in the party platform. Now, early on, as part of this lobbying, Pearl went and lobbied this Missouri senator, Harry Truman. He agreed to support the ERA. She liked him. They became friendly. And when he became FDR's vice president, she gave him a big party at the Sulgrave Club. And he had such a good time, he played the piano until late at night. So 6 weeks later, FDR is dead. Harry Truman's the vice president, is the president, and Pearl is the hottest ticket in town. Bess Truman doesn't want to entertain. Pearl is happy to do the entertaining for her. And so Bess and Pearl and the Truman's daughter, Margaret, excuse me, they are inseparable. Imagine Donald Trump and Elon Musk, that kind of inseparable. They went everywhere together. They did everything together. And Pearl kept trying to fix Margaret up with this dashing Massachusetts Congressman, Jack Kennedy. Margaret Truman's diaries are at the Truman Library, and it was really fun to read this. You know, Pearl took Jack and I to the Ice Capades and then to the home of Vanderbilt, or I've got the flu, but I'm getting up and going to this party because Pearl's going to seat me next to Jack. It didn't take, but they knew each other for a long time. Now, Pearl became famous for inviting politicians from both political parties to her house for fun evenings. And all right, we all know the Washington evening where somebody says, Senator so-and-so, could you please discuss the tariffs? Pearl didn't want to do that. She had Broadway stars come sing. She had fortune tellers. She had orchestras. Later in life, she had hootenannies. I mean, she really wanted people to have fun. But she also liked that feeling behind the scenes where so-and-so would like a job and so-and-so might be able to give them the job, and putting people together in rooms. And one of the people she became very close to was Sam Rayburn. And Sam thought she ought to meet his protege, Lyndon Johnson. And both of Johnson's daughters told me, Pearl saw potential in Daddy. And she thought that, you know, he ought to meet people, and she wanted to open some doors for him. And Daddy didn't know many important people in Washington, and he was very grateful to Pearl. In 1948, at the same time, I read so many memoirs trying to figure, I was hoping to find out things that happened at Pearl's parties behind the scenes, and it was really impossible. But when I began to track the progress of the ERA through Congress, I discovered that every time it was up for a vote, Pearl was giving a big party in hoping to try to put it over the top. I mean, literally, it was party, vote. And then, you know, when the ERA failed, she would give up the rental house, go back to the Solgrave Club for a few months until starting again. In 1948, when Harry Truman's re-election campaign was running out of money, Pearl was asked to help. He was on the Ferdinand Magellan. I can't make train noises. Anyhow, she flew from Newport to Texas. She rattled the silver cup. She invited all her friends to come on board, and she raised enough money to help, you know, keep the train rolling. She was one of the few people who, at that point, believed that Truman, well remember, Dewey beats Truman. She believed in him. Now, her first honor was to be named chair of Truman's inaugural ball. And at that point, as you may remember, there was a huge rift in the Democratic Party. Senators like Strom Thurmond had walked out very angry over Truman's, all the legislation he had proposed for integration. And so that Pearl discovered there was a plot afoot at the inaugural committee to keep down black turnout. People weren't including the RSVP cards. There were lots of little things done. And she spent many hours working very hard to make sure that it was okay. And it was really, you know, gratifying to read these stories in, you know, Chicago Defender, Black Newspapers Today, saying it was the first inauguration that was truly integrated. And Pearl may not have a big part, but she did have a part in that. Thanks to her campaign fundraising prowess, Truman rewarded Pearl by naming her as the American envoy to Luxembourg. Not ambassador, because at that point it wasn't ambassador level, but there was a huge furor. I mean, oh my God, you know, this friend of the president was going to get this job. Pearl was worried. She knew that she didn't know languages. She had never been a book reader. She didn't know foreign policy. But she felt that if Truman wanted her to go and represent America, that she would do her best to do so. Now, her time in Luxembourg was both frustrating and fulfilling. You will not be surprised to hear or remember that the State Department was filled with Ivy League educated men who'd either fought in World War II or been in the State Department, and they were outraged that a woman who had never gone to college, who gave parties, who had no diplomatic experience, would get this job. And it's funny reading the newspaper clips. It's like every major publication in America decided that Luxembourg was the center of the action. There were hundreds of reporters descending on Luxembourg to write about Pearl. um, at the same sorry about this. I think I have a few. This is, I should have this later. This is Gwen Cafritz, and Gwen was Pearl's big Washington rival before, during, and after Truman. They later became friends, but you can see Gwen was gorgeous, you know, thin, beautiful. Pearl was not. And this is Pearl, Bess Truman, and several other women who were very important in the Democratic Party. I love the hats. Pearl with William O. Douglas. This is, again, out of order, but shows the kind of people attracted to her parties. Pearl in Luxembourg. So she decided she wanted to be a different kind of diplomat. Instead of just spending time with the Foreign Service people, she and her sister drove all over the country, meeting mayors, meeting local citizens. She went to an orphanage, and she was so heartbroken, obviously war orphans, she began to give annual yearly parties, which of course she spent her own money on, and that became a huge hit. She realized a lot of the mayors had never met each other, so she began giving parties so that the Luxembourg mayors could meet each other. And then one day, 3 GIs knocked on the door of the residence, and they had made a bet that they couldn't meet the envoy. And Pearl invited them for dinner, and the next day her sister said, those guys said they were really homesick. So Pearl said, oh. So she started this tradition of once a month she would have a party for GIs. She would have a band. By the end of it, she was renting a hall. She would write notes to their family saying she'd met them. She estimated she entertained 25,000 GIs during her time. And later in life, I found, people went to see her in her 80s and 90s saying, here's a letter you wrote to my mother. It mattered. So, all right, after, don't you get the benefit of seeing me early? It's fresh, but it's not all perfect. After she finished her diplomatic tour, Pearl continued to have adventures for 2 more decades. When you're writing a book, you're thinking, I'm done. You realize, no, I'm just getting started. In 1953, Pearl had just stepped down from Luxembourg, and the Russians invited her to come visit. This was unheard of. Stalin had just died. She became the first American, really, to be allowed to tour all over Russia. She wrote a series that syndicated in newspapers, and when she came back, she became a major speaker on Russia and communism. Now, she was very disappointed that her dear friend Ike wouldn't appoint her to another embassy, and she decided in 1955 that she would send herself around the world. She would be a goodwill ambassador from the country of Pearl. And she got the State Department to help set up visits. And of course, a lot of foreign embassies thought Pearl was not shy about stating that she was a good friend of the president. So they all thought, if she comes to our country and meets our prime minister, maybe that'll help loosen funds. So she went around the world and ended up having to flee a riot in Saigon. Lots of drama. Now, in 1960, she really wanted LBJ to be president. As you remember, he didn't run in the primaries. JFK was, hugely ahead, but he was hoping to have his big chance at the convention. So Pearl, gave this 5,000 person brunch for him at the convention. She was really big for it. And when he decided to accept the VP slot, he met with a small group of people in his hotel room. Pearl was among them. When he told her, Pearl ran up and grabbed his tie and began yanking on it and saying, "You betrayed us." There's a whole, it's in the Johnson Library. She was furious. And then she went on from there to the Republican convention and in Chicago. And even though she had said some few unkind things about the Kennedys, but nothing that she couldn't have recovered from, she gave this disastrous interview to the Associated Press. And let me start for a second and go back for a second and say she was very close to Janet Auchincloss. I mean, they had been friendly, Jackie O's mother. They'd been friendly for years in Newport, in Washington. Pearl always said that she'd known Jackie since Jackie was a little girl. Pearl gave a huge party in 1953 in London for the inauguration of, or the swearing in, sorry, not inauguration, swearing in of Queen Elizabeth. Jackie was then the inquiring photographer. She wanted to go to the party. She went and knocked on Pearl's door. Can I go? Pearl invited her. So Pearl knew them. And the book cover is a picture of Jackie and Pearl at Pearl's party at the 1956 convention. Now I have to tell you, this may be the only time that JFK was actually cropped out of a picture. He was over here, but he wouldn't have fit on the book jacket. And I'm going to stop for 1 second because I know I'm way ahead of the pictures. Yeah, this is Pearl and Harry Truman. Pearl and Margaret Truman. This is the Time magazine cover that I mentioned. This is Pearl meeting Ike. So, Pearl is at the Republican convention in Chicago, and she gives this interview to the Associated Press. And I'm indulging myself by reading just because I want to get it right. Pearl was incredibly upset. What apparently triggered Pearl's ire was seeing glowing pictures of Jack and Jackie looking relaxed on Cape Cod. The AP reporter wrote that Pearl was, quote, in a tizzy. Quote, Pearl is not sold on the ticket. Her problem is that she does not see eye to eye on several matters with Jacqueline Kennedy, the wife of the presidential candidate. For example, Mrs. Mesta cites stockings. Quote, do you know, she fumes indignantly, half the time Jacqueline doesn't even wear stockings. Oh my God. Pearl shivers at the prospect of a White House managed by a first lady from Hyannisport wearing no stockings and a bandana on her head. Why, do you know, they run around with all sorts of people and they'd invite Joey Bishop, Frank Sinatra, and Sammy Davis Jr. to the White House? They're all part of that clan. I don't know what I'm going to do. Here's what she did. She threw her support behind Richard Nixon, and she campaigned with the Democrats for Nixon. I think I have one of those here. Let's see. That's Pearl with Ethel Merman, LBJ, at her big party for him, convention. Yep, I'm a Democrat for Nixon. Well, as you can imagine, Pearl's actions were equivalent of committing social suicide. And she had been in the White House under every president up till then, and she could not get invited back, and it made her crazy. I mean, she did everything possible to ingratiate herself. She wrote columns talking about the wonderful, Jackie Kennedy and her fabulous mother, and she gave interviews, and they just were not budging. In November of 1963, Pearl went to Puerto Rico. She was then writing her column for McCall's and Entertaining, and one of the staffers then later wrote a memoir, and she talked about how they arrived at this event, and they heard that JFK had been assassinated. And Pearl, basically, she blurted out, I always knew JFK was going to be president. But that was, what was amazing about this is 12 days later, there were already articles in the paper, will Pearl be welcomed back at the White House? I mean, she was that, people wanted something frivolous to think about. And sure enough, come January 64, there are White House tapes of LBJ calling Pearl, inviting her, and from then on, she was a regular. And so I can't stress enough how well-connected Pearl was. I came up with the title for this book, The Woman Who Knew Everyone, after writing chapters in which she met Marilyn Monroe, Nikita Khrushchev, Queen Elizabeth, and rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. She was also friendly with Claire Booth Luce, Judy Garland, Angela Lansbury, and Pearl Bailey. Now, she got to know Pearl Bailey in a kind of interesting way. Pearl Bailey was the first Black actress who played Perle Mesta in a road company of Call Me Madam. Pearl, of course, Perle Mesta saw her out. They became friends. They were always doing various things together. In 1968, as you remember, there were horrible riots in Washington after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the Parks Department wanted to do something later that summer to kind of cheer up. It was the Shaw neighborhood, and they wanted to throw a party. Now, if you were going to throw an inner city party, would you get in touch with a white woman in her mid 80s to organize the thing? They called Perle Mesta. And she called Pearl Bailey, who called Cab Calloway. And the next thing you know, 20,000 people attended this celebratory event. Now, and when Perle Mesta was back in Oklahoma City, failing in a nursing home, Pearl Bailey flew in especially to sing to her, sing spirituals. After Pearl died, her friends wanted to petition the post office to get a stamp named in her honor. And they got Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Richard Nixon to all write letters on her behalf, which is kind of a big deal. She didn't get her stamp, but I mean, as a biographer, it's really rare to find a historical figure who was once very famous and has vanished and have a chance to bring them back to life, which I'm very grateful I got to do. I'm going to close on a personal note, which is basically that many of you, almost everyone in this room, also knew my husband, Walter Shapiro, who died in July. And while my name is in the cover on the book, Walter's could easily be there as well because he was so involved in this book. He went with me on all the research trips, and he turned them into working vacations for both of us. So when I was in the Eisenhower Library in Kansas, reading Ike and Mamie's letters to Pearl, Walter was reading all the material on Ike's heart attack so we could write a column on heart attacks. We went straight from the Truman library in Kansas so Walter could interview Lucas, I think it's Kuntz, who was running for Senate. Walter researched all of the James Beard nominees so we could eat well on these trips. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I took my last American history course, maybe 50 years ago. So it went in and out. So I had to relearn American history as part of doing this book. Walter is a political junkie. He has collected over the years hundreds, thousands of books, and they're under our beds, they're in our kitchen closets. I'm very grateful to James Holmes and Annie, who took care of the Washington part of the books, hundreds of books here. But Walter's favorite thing is, and I kind of, I never discouraged him from buying books, but it was a little over the top. And I would say, I need to know what happened in 1940 at the Republican convention in Philadelphia. And Walter would go, and he'd grab a book down. It made him so happy. Now, I turned in a doorstop of a book because I didn't know what was important. So I put in everything. And I was told I had to cut it by a third, which meant Walter had to cut it by a third. And we sat there and he said, I love you, Meryl, this anecdote, gotta go. So he wrote, sort of political, background in various places. He added funny asides. What can I say? I couldn't have done it without him. I would like to think, given the collective memory of all of you of Walter, that his spirit is with us today. So let me close by saying we had a wonderful time together in this book. I hope you'll like it. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Sorry. Oh, so have to know, did she see Ethel Merman in Calling Madam, and what did she think?
She and Ethel Merman became very close friends. They, every time Pearl needed someone to perform, Ethel would turn up. She was initially told not to go. The State Department sent Pearl a letter saying, a telegram saying, don't go to the opening night, because they thought it was kind of frivolous, would make fun of her. And then Pearl went to President Truman and said, I really want to go. He said, oh, go, take my daughter, take my wife. What was so funny, if any of you remember the show, they make fun endlessly of Margaret's opera singing. And operas, in Margaret's diaries, it's all about, I hated this show. Yeah.
Hi, I know from Lady Bird's journals that that LBJ's family lived at Pearl's house when he was vice president. Do you write about that?
I do. It's funny, you try to figure out what to talk about. When there were two things going on, in addition to me losing my voice. Pearl's, unbeknownst to the world, Pearl's sister had lost all of her money. And Pearl's sister actually owned the house they were living in. Everyone thought it belonged to Pearl. So they needed to sell the house. Now, there were all these stories saying, oh, Pearl's going to leave Washington because Kennedy's in the White House, she'll never be invited. And Pearl kept saying, I'm not selling my house. And then suddenly she's selling the house. Now, Pearl was trying to figure out, who would like to buy my house? And she thought, oh, well, there's this politician who lives in a very small house who needs to entertain. And so she called LBJ. And one wonderful story, at least I thought it was wonderful. Lucy told me that Pearl was selling some of the furniture, and she went with her mother to look at what they had. And Lucy was taking piano lessons, and she really wanted the Steinway. And she was really lobbying, and Pearl's like really sympathetic and saying, I'll give you a great price on it. And, and Lady Bird finally said, the only person who plays piano in the family is Lucy, and she's terrible. No piano. So the day they move into the house, Lucy said, I was sort of skipping through the rooms, and I got to the piano. There was a big red bow and a note saying, Lucy, and you win. So I thought that was really sweet. And she still has the piano.
We have a small contingent here from Watson Place, and this is where Pearl, that's one of our claims to fame.
She did.
Sells as a very down-to-earth kind of informal place. So I just wonder if you know anything about why she moved there and when and how many parties were held there, that kind of thing.
She moved there right after she sold the house to LBJ. And again, because she had financial issues, the developer thought that it would be really prestigious to have Pearl moved in. So he offered her a cut rate deal. She got the same kind of cut rate deal later at the Sheraton Park. I wish that nobody's been offering me because I'm famous. And she took over a whole series of apartments. They did elaborate renovations. And then eventually they threw her out, basically, because they were selling the apartments and she didn't want to buy or couldn't afford to buy. So then she moved on to the Sheraton.
Hi, Meryl.
Hi, Sheila.
When she was envoy to Luxembourg, that was when Europe was reorganizing after World War II. Was she involved in talks about NATO or any of the...
The NATO talks had happened before then. And in fact, while she was there, Ike was named head of NATO, the first head. So he actually kept coming to visit her. He treated Luxembourg as if it were a strategic, it was to the extent of, it was bordered by Germany and France and Belgium. But it was interesting because I spent a lot of time trying to read through the voluminous State Department material in Luxembourg. I think she let the deputies kind of run the show to some extent, but she certainly became more knowledgeable about issues as the time went by.
Thank you.
Well, all right, Steve.
So, how much did the Vietnam War affect her relationship with LBJ and that period?
Somebody asked me the other night were there things that Pearl approved of that I disapproved of, and the answer is yes, Vietnam. She was a big supporter of LBJ. She traveled the country, she was giving all these lectures, and she supported him. So she believed in him, she was an anti-communist, and, that was the side of history she chose to go down on.
Hi, Meryl. This may sound like a frivolous question, but I don't think you do anything just by accident. So the significance of the purple in the cover and the inside is for royalty or what?
I'd love to say it was me. This is the publisher. Let me see if there's anything else I haven't shown. I think we're, oops. Pearl with Mamie. And you can just see what a life of the party she was. She was just a bubbling, lively personality. Always sorry I didn't get to meet her. So thank you all for coming, and I will